I know what you want. I know what you came here for. That thing you crave more than anything else. It's a primal urge. It drives men to absurd distances and to engage in ruthless and inhuman acts. It's a high unlike any other, known only to those few who have indulged in its infinite pleasures. An addiction stronger than any known narcotic, yet whose health effects are limited to occasional bouts of mild smoke inhalation. Do you know that of which I speak? It's trains. Welcome to the 8th episode of Franklin, the City Skylines series that comes out 2 days late. Today we're going to be talking about trains. We'll start by talking a little bit about what I built last episode while I was talking about politics, then talk about steam power and steam locomotion. Then we'll talk about how early railroads operated. Then we'll talk a little bit about how they were built and the insane incentives, profiteering, and legal wrangling that went on behind the scenes to make railroads profitable. Then I want to do a few announcements at the end of the video. Now, this episode will probably be pretty light on leftist politics, but pretty heavy on trains. Don't worry though, the next episode is going to be on organized labor. So we've mostly been building industry on the waterfront. This is because goods and materials have to be schlepped to a boat to transport them usually. So it makes sense to build near navigable water. One thing I haven't really mentioned in which I haven't built are canals. There's a lock at the Goodhill Waterworks from episode 6, and that's about it. But if I'd been paying attention, Franklin would have at least 2 proper canals up the side of the 2 rivers at this point. They'll be rendered irrelevant pretty soon, though. So we'll be building 2 railroads today. The Hamden and Amboy, which will start across the river from Franklin and in Hamden and head to a point that would be just south of Bisquicklehausen series Gramercy. And then the Franklin and Berwyn, which is going to start in the city proper. I was going to do 3 railroads, but I didn't have the time. This episode's late already. But before we talk about the railroads themselves, I want to talk about steam engines. So steam engines have existed since as far back as the 1st century AD, but they were mostly novelties back then. The Roman steam engines were usually just a hollow ball with 2 opposing nozzles on it. It was placed on 2 bearings so it could rotate. It's filled with water, and you built a fire underneath it. The steam escaping from the nozzles spun the ball around. Now, this is fun and interesting to look at, but it couldn't really power anything larger than a spit for roasting meat. Practical steam power didn't appear until Thomas Newcomen developed a commercially successful 5-horsepower steam pump in 1712 for pumping water out of mines. And then Richard Trevithick developed the first relatively high-pressure steam engine in 1799 in England and built the first locomotive 5 years later. So we got to talk about the steam locomotive, and what I say here is also applicable more generically to steam engines. So a steam locomotive runs on water and heat. That heat is provided by some kind of fuel, usually coal or oil, but especially in the early days it was wood. The fuel is put in the firebox, which is a box with fire in it. The fuel burns and boils water in the boiler. What we're looking at here is a fire tube boiler, where a series of tubes are run through the main body of the boiler, through which the heat from the firebox flows. The opposite, a water tube boiler, also exists and can generate steam much more efficiently, but it was never frequently used in steam locomotives. As the water from the boiler turns to steam, it builds pressure. When the engineer opens the throttle, the steam flows through pipes to the cylinders. The cylinder has 4 valves on it, 2 at each end. The steam enters through one valve and expands, moving the piston one way. Once the steam is expanded, the other valve opens and the steam escapes as steam is forced in from the other side. A device called the valve gear, which is controlled by a reverser lever, alters the timing of these valves, allowing for more efficient use of steam depending on the speed of the train, as well as actually controlling the direction of the locomotive. Now this, of course, has 4-stroke and 2-stroke engines beat. A reciprocating steam engine is actually a 1-stroke engine. This back and forth motion is converted into rotational motion by the side rods. They act on what are called the driving wheels. This is as opposed to guiding wheels and trailing wheels, which are not powered. So how do we tell different steam locomotives apart? It's by the wheel arrangement. We'll go over the Whyte System for classifying steam locomotives. This is Thomas the Tank Engine. He has no guiding wheels, 6 driving wheels, and no trailing wheels, making him an 060. This is Henry the Green Engine. He has 4 guiding wheels, 6 driving wheels, and no trailing wheels, making him a 460. Although he's stuck in a tunnel, so it doesn't matter. This is Gordon the Big Engine. He has 4 guiding wheels, 6 driving wheels, and 2 trailing wheels, making him a 462. This arrangement is also called a Pacific type. This is a Norfolk and Western A-class. It has 2 guiding wheels, 2 sets of 6 driving wheels, and 4 trailing wheels, making it a 2664. This is an East African Railways Class 59. It has 2 sets of wheels, each with 4 guiding wheels, 8 driving wheels, and 2 trailing wheels, making it a 482 plus 284. This locomotive has 2 driving wheels, an interstitial, unpowered pair of wheels, and then another driving wheel. And it's unclassifiable bull. Locomotive wheel arrangements had significant effect on how locomotives performed. For instance, the Pennsylvania Railroad 462 K4S and 282 L1S were nearly identical other than their wheel arrangement, but the L1S's smaller driving wheels and greater proportion of weight on said wheels gave it much more tractive effort, which is kind of like its pulling power, than the K4S. The K4S, however, had better riding characteristics and a higher top speed, owing to its extra guiding wheels and larger driving wheels, respectively. Now, those engines are all from the 20th century, though. We're still in 1830, so we got to talk about early steam locomotives. Now, there were dozens of experimental designs, most of which were catastrophic failures in one way or another. There was the Crampton, for instance, which had a single pair of huge driving wheels, giving it a high theoretical top speed. However, its position under the cab meant there was little weight on that axle, so its ability to actually pull trains was extremely limited. Then there was the Fontaine, designed to increase speed by having a large upper wheel drive a small lower one, which proved only to cause extra wheel slip. Then there was the Holman locomotive, which was a radical design which promised the world to investors. 2 prototypes were made, but in the end the whole scheme turned out to be a grift and stock market swindle. Sound familiar? The locomotive our railroads will be using are simple 240 locomotives, which I based on the John Bull, the first steam locomotive on the Camden and Amboy Railroad. The original John Bull was imported from England, but local manufacturers quickly reverse-engineered the locomotive and built their own. In 1830, there would have been almost no standardization of locomotives, but I didn't want to model 10 different kinds of steam locomotives that I would only use once, so what we have is a fleet of John Bulls. Now, at this point in history, there are three kinds of railroad cars. There's the flat car, the house car, and the passenger car. Freight that can get rained on goes on the flat car. A freight that can't get rained on goes in the house car, which is a pre-Civil War term for what we now call a boxcar. Passengers go in a passenger car. That's easy. So your railroads are initially competing with canals for freight transportation and with stagecoaches for passenger transportation. And the railroads promise speed, comfort, and safety, but only really delivered on speed. Trains could travel at the frightful and nearly unheard of speed of 20 to 30 miles an hour. The public was initially terrified of this. There was a persistent rumor that these terrifying speeds would suffocate passengers, or even that high speeds would suck women's uteruses out of their bodies. Right. But despite the public's trepidation, sustained speeds of 20 to 30 miles an hour were common. It was on rough, jointed rail, which resulted in a bumpy, uncomfortable ride. The railroad cars were fitted only with hard wooden benches, and creature comforts like ventilation and heating were afterthoughts. But even worse than the comfort was early railroad safety. Today, trains have air brakes, where the engineer can set the brakes on the whole train with one lever in the locomotive. In the early days, however, brakes had to be set manually on each railroad car. So to stop or slow the train, a guy called the brakeman had to run down the train on the top of freight cars to set the handbrakes on each car manually while the train was in motion. Now, that was a little easier on passenger trains, as you could walk through the cars instead of running on top of them, but either way, a rapid stop was impossible under almost any circumstances. And this was exacerbated, of course, by the way railroads were built. Many charters, which we'll talk about in a minute, allowed railroads to be built directly down existing streets and roads. However, if there is a fast train going down the middle of the street, it can't really stop quickly, and that's a clear safety hazard for traffic, and accidents were extremely common. Horses and carriages were pulverized by trains so regularly that the cow catcher was invented to push obstacles, like cows or horses, out of the way of the train. This improved the safety of the train, but any cows or other animals caught by the cow catcher was still dead. And railroads had very primitive or no signaling systems at this time. You were effectively driving blind. Timetables and engineers' orders had to be perfectly accurate, or trains would run into each other. This was even worse at night, when primitive oil lamp headlights provided next to no illumination. If a train did crash, it was absolutely catastrophic. If the train had heating, it was usually provided by a coal stove in each wooden passenger car. This stove would usually tip over and light the train on fire. Passenger cars would also frequently telescope, which is when one car pushes its way inside the one in front of it. This could happen to many cars in succession, with huge amounts of casualties. It wasn't so great. So, how did these railroads get built? Typically, a charter was written up by a state or municipality for a company to build a railroad from one place to another place. These charters typically granted the railroad certain rights, like the right to access private property to survey land, or even delegated powers like eminent domain to the railroad for the purpose of securing right-of-way, or the land the actual tracks sit on. Right-of-way typically comes in the form of an easement rather than outright land ownership. The railroad doesn't technically own the land, but has nearly all the same rights as a landowner would. Sometimes land grants were offered to the railroad as a means of financing the railroad, especially for those which traveled in very undeveloped territory. The first transcontinental railroad was financed this way. Massive land grants were offered to the railroad as it progressed west. This land was uninhabited, except of course by the Native Americans who actually lived there, so the government felt entitled to just hand it out to private companies. If not offered land grants, then railroads would typically buy land on each side of their right-of-way as they built. Once the railroad was complete and the trains were running, the railroad built stations at small towns and crossroads, and the land around them was sold at a huge profit since the railroad made the land more accessible and thus more valuable. This is a pattern which is going to be repeated many times in this series. So, especially in the early days, these railroad charters were very vague, stating that a company was to build a road from one place to another place. No one was quite sure how railroads were supposed to work. Some even provided for the operation of private rail vehicles on the railroad, though this never happened in practice. But the vagueness left them ripe for abuse. If you were clever, you could get a charter to allow you to do something entirely other than what the charter actually stated. For instance, the Pennsylvania Railroad, which we'll talk about much more in later episodes, found itself in a conundrum when it wanted to extend its main line from Baltimore to Washington, D.C. The state of Maryland refused to allow another railroad to enter Washington in order to preserve the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad's monopoly. Yeah, they had crony capitalism back then, too. Although crony capitalism is just capitalism. Anyway, the Pennsylvania Railroad bought another railroad, the Baltimore and Potomac, which had a charter to build a main line from Baltimore to Port Tobacco, Maryland. And, crucially, which allowed for 20 miles of branch lines. So they built the line from Baltimore to Port Tobacco, and it is what is now the town of Bowie, Maryland, built a single 20-mile branch line right into Washington, D.C. That branch line is now Amtrak's Northeast Corridor, while the actual Baltimore and Potomac Railroad, as chartered, is a little-used branch line serving a coal power plant next to the Potomac River Bridge on Route 301. Now, in the early days, railroads didn't really connect with each other. They had different couplers, incompatible rolling stock, and worst of all, different gauges. Now, railroad gauge refers to the distance between the two rails. Early railroads were built with absurd and arbitrary gauges, 5 feet, 6 feet, 4 feet 10 inches, and so on. But after the Civil War, most railroads were converted to standard gauge, which is a nice even 4 feet 8.5 inches. But before that, most freight cars couldn't travel on most other railroads' tracks. Freight and passengers had to be schlepped from one railroad car to another nearly identical railroad car, wherever the railroad changed or where there was any other break of gauge, which sometimes even occurred where one railroad had built with 2 gauges out of convenience. I suppose we should conclude by talking about how the railroads were actually physically built, with a whole bunch of manual labor. Now, railroads can't travel up steep hills, so the terrain has to be cut and filled where the railroad travels over rough terrain. This was done with people called navvies, which is a relic from when they worked on canals, or navigations as they were sometimes referred to. Now, the thing about these navvies was they were surprisingly well paid. So what's the catch? Well, navvies did backbreaking manual labor all day, every day. They lived in a camp which moved with the railroad as it was under construction, usually with some pretty bad sanitation. These camps usually also had insufficient beds for the whole workforce, and was otherwise generally unpleasant to live in. The work was extremely dangerous, especially while constructing especially large fills or cuts. Landslides were common and commonly fatal. And that's to say nothing of tunneling, where you did all this in the dark. This is why railroad construction was such a high-paying job. No one wanted to do it. Most early railroad workers on the East Coast were Irish immigrants, though tunnel work typically called for former miners from Wales and Scotland. On the West Coast, Chinese immigrants were most commonly employed, though railroads on the West Coast would not be built for several years. So those were the early railroads. They were fast, yes, but they were dirty, dangerous and uncomfortable, and owing to their patchwork construction by private companies, subject to arbitrary delays at junctions and transfers between railroads. Many operated as glorified land grabs, operating minimal service required by their charter. Others ran many trains right down city streets, killing horses and people every week. Primitive signaling systems are still decades off, and centralized dispatching wasn't even a dream yet, and air brakes will not arrive until after the Civil War. And yet the railroads will keep expanding more and more rapidly, as we'll see. Okay, so quick channel announcement. I put out a crap load of content in the past month, and I realized this ain't a sustainable pace. I was hoping the power planning and politics episodes would take a day to do at most, but now they take longer than the Franklin episodes. So next month I'm going down to one video a week. I'm thinking it'll be a 5-week cycle with 2 power planning and politics and 2 Franklins, with 1 week off where I can work on assets to keep the series going. Also, I said I'd do a live stream this month, but I've screwed up my schedule enough to where I need to push it off to early next month. Sorry about that, guys. And this is the part of the episode where I do the commercial. Now, it's the end of the month, so, left Twitter is completely jam-packed with folks asking for money to help on the rent. So, hey, guess what I'm going to do? If y'all are on the fence about donating to the Patreon, I personally recommend trying it out this month. Later this week, the first bonus episode is going to drop. It's going to be on Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, also known as Black Wall Street, and the riots in 1921. Though this first bonus episode is going to be free, every subsequent one will be an unlisted video, which will be posted on the Patreon for folks who give me $1 a month. That Patreon is down there in the description, and there's only one tier. It's $1 a month. Everything else, you're just giving me more money. You don't get more stuff. If you don't want to support me monthly or just want to contribute to this rent-paying pledge drive, I also have a Buy Me a Coffee link below. I'm not going to spend it on coffee, though. I'm going to spend it on rent, and whatever is left goes to beer. Hopefully, with all y'all's support, I won't have to do a pledge drive like this ever again, though if I do, I promise to do it properly and give people tote bags. Or maybe just a t-shirt that says rent control on it. I don't know. I mean, I can't thank you all enough for your Patreon support so far, and I'm really happy with all y'all who donated, but despite the fact that the channel's growing real quickly, it isn't quickly enough to satisfy my landlord. So please share with everyone who might be interested, and consider supporting the channel if you aren't currently. Or hell, just support for 1 month and cancel the Patreon afterwards. I don't care. So anyway, thanks for your support, and on to the cinematics.